Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm very excited to bring the conversation I had with Eckart Frahm. Eckart is the professor of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Yale University. His main interests are in Assyrian and Babylonian history and Mesopotamia at large during the first millennium. He is the author of many articles and many books, including the most recent, Assyria, the Rise and Fall of the World's First Empire, which is what we talk about in this conversation. We begin the conversation by talking about an overview of some of the various Assyrian periods. We talk about what makes northern Iraq and Mesopotamia this type of fertile ground for being a hotbed for so many different people groups and cultures throughout society past or civilizations past. We talk about the impact of language on Assyria, the importance of Ashur as a god and as a city. We talk about the beginning of rulers in Old Assyrian period, the Middle Assyrian period, major rulers in Assyria, distinctions between Assyria and Babylon. We talk about the fall of Nineveh and the Assyrian Empire. We talk about how the Assyrian Empire works within the biblical accounts of Assyria, and the second destruction of Assyrian artifacts by ISIS, which happened a few years ago. As I mentioned in the conversation a few times, I have a little bit of some touching points with Assyria and Mesopotamian culture in my own training and education. So, it was just such a treat for me to talk to such an expert in the Assyrian culture and civilization. I hadn't thought about this stuff in a while, and it was just so wonderful to talk with him about something that is really important for our understanding of humanity, for our understanding of human civilization, big people groups, many years ago, but trying to understand more of what makes humans interesting in different parts of the world, how they have impact generations later, and how we're still finding artifacts and many aspects of long ago cultures of different people groups. I think it's really important work. He's the top guy on Assyrian civilization, and it really was an honor to talk to him for 2 hours, which I greatly enjoyed. You can listen to this conversation and all other conversations at my free Substack, convergingdialogues.substack.com. So subscribe there. And now I bring you Eckart Frahm. I am here with Eckart Frahm. Eckart, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you about your book.
Well, thanks a lot for having me.
Yes, of course. So you've written a wonderful book. It's called Assyria, the Rise and Fall of the World's First Empire. I absolutely loved it. And it was really nice to get kind of a nice, objective, fresh history on one of the early empires of for humanity. So before we get into it, just tell folks a little bit about yourself, what your background's in, what you do, where you teach, research, and all the particulars.
All right, so my name is Eckart Frahm. I am a professor of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Yale. Originally, I hail from Germany, as my accent, I'm afraid, reveals only too clearly. I have been here in the States for quite a while, though. And my research has, in fact, focused on Assyria, on Assyrian history for many years. I wrote my dissertation on an Assyrian king, Sennacherib. I've also been interested in the intellectual history of ancient Mesopotamia. Assyria is part of the many civilizations that thrived in this area of ancient Iraq. And I do like to connect intellectual and cultural history with political history. Assyria is a particularly fruitful topic in this respect because our sources are so rich that we can really approach a history of Assyria from really very different angles. And the book is primarily a political history, but it also attempts to show, how religion and culture, literature impacted Assyria in various ways.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we start to see if one will study different civilizations that there's overlap in some things, but there are some things that make certain civilizations, certain empires distinct. um, some people may be familiar with obviously the Roman Empire, at the beginning of the first century, maybe familiar with the height of the Persian Empire, maybe the Babylonians, there's some crossover there. But the Assyrians, what many people may not know is before this, at least at their height. And so one of the very unique things, I would say, or maybe not entirely unique, but at least for the time, was how quickly the fall of the Assyrian Empire was, which you detail in the book, which I also thought was interesting. So well, I want to give the overview, but I'll just lay my cards on the table for listeners. Some people may know that I have a background in theology. I went to a Reformed seminary and studied a lot of this stuff for many years, and so I always knew Assyria as the villains if you're taking a Judeo-Christian perspective, which is obviously not true. There's obviously not a this false dichotomy of good and bad or whatever, but it was really really nice for me to read your book from an objective standpoint, hearing familiar names and dates and places that I had learned from a different vantage point and just seeing it with a broader lens was really really wonderful and captivating. And so I had a blast reading it, and so I'm thrilled to look at it from a different lens. So I really appreciate it. Let's start with an overview of the Assyrian Empire. You talk about these different periods: the Old Assyrian, the transition, the Middle Assyrian, the Neo-Assyrian. Could you just kind of give us an overview of the Assyrian Empire in terms of the periods in the timeline, and then and kind of where it's located at in modern day and things like that?
Right. So let's perhaps start with geography, which of course defines empire very much. So the Assyria is an ancient land located in the northeastern area, what is today the Republic of Iraq, marked by a triangle formed by three cities: Nineveh, which is on the other side of the Tigris, opposite of the modern city of Mosul; Al-Bela, the modern city of Erbil in northeastern Iraq; and a city named Ashur, some 100 kilometers or 60 miles south of Mosul on the Tigris River. So this is sort of the core area of Assyria. And from there, the Assyrians at some point started to expand and eventually become what I have called the world's first empire. Of course, something one can question. Maybe we can discuss this later. The name Assyria is actually Greek. So this is how the Greeks referred to this land in their historical writings. It goes back, though, to an Assyrian word, an Assyrian name, that's Ashur. That's also, in fact, the name with which the Hebrew Bible refers to Assyria. So the land of Assyria, that's Eretz Ashur in Hebrew. And that name, Ashur, is originally the name of the city of Ashur, which I mentioned as being on the southern end of Assyria, actually, which is really the incubator of Assyrian civilization. So this is where in the third millennium BCE, Assyrian civilization began to emerge. And the first period for which we have fairly ample documentation is the so-called Old Assyrian period. That is a time sort of between 2000 BCE and 1700 BCE. And at this point, there isn't really yet a state of Assyria. There's only a city-state of Ashur. So Ashur doesn't really have political power reaching much beyond the limits of the city. But it already has a pretty broad geographic horizon. That's thanks to the fact that Ashur at this point is the hub of a commercial network. We can talk about that in greater detail later. But at any rate, you have merchants from the city of Ashur traveling far and wide, especially into Anatolia, trading tin and textiles for silver. And this is essentially how Assyria comes into itself as this city-state with this commercial network. There are a few centuries that occasionally called the Dark Age, always a problematic term because the question is the darkness in the eye of the beholder? Was it really such a dark age? So between 1700 and 1400 BCE is 300 years where we don't really know that much what's going on. But a lot is actually happening, because when the dust settles after this period, we see that, we see the actual emergence of an Assyrian territorial state. So in the 14th century, Ashur begins to expand. There are now also kings, real kings in charge. We can talk about that as well as we move on. As this Middle Assyrian period, which lasts about until 1000 BCE, continues, Assyria expands its borders, especially to the west, to the Chabur River. That's a tributary of the Euphrates River. Mesopotamia is a term literally between the rivers that refers to the land between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. At any rate, Assyria is now not only this land from Ashur to Nineveh and to Arbela, but also further west. So it becomes a major territorial state, interacting with other states at that time, like Egypt, the Hittite kingdom in Anatolia, Babylonia in the south. The Middle Assyrian period ends around 1000 and is followed by another crisis, so about 100 years, from which we have few sources where we see another contraction of Assyrian power, but not a complete breakdown. So the Assyrian royal dynasty remains in power. And when the dust settles yet again, so in the second half of the 10th century BCE, we see the Assyrian state slowly but steadily expanding into an even larger geopolitical entity. This doesn't happen without crises again, but in the second half of the 8th century BCE, Assyria is the preeminent political entity in all of Western Asia, and becomes what I would say is indeed the world's first empire. This is the time of kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal, famous kings known also from the Hebrew Bible, when Assyria reaches geographically from Western Iran to Egypt and from central Turkey down to the Persian Gulf. So this is the time of its greatest expansion. And as you already pointed out, this then ends remarkably quickly and dramatically with the collapse of this great kingdom during the years between 626 and 609. So just within 12, 15 years or so, Syria breaks down almost entirely. The Assyrian statehood comes to an end at the end of this period. Assyrian culture, at least religious culture, lives on to some extent. The god Ashur, who's worshipped in the city of his name, remains a deity of some significance in that city and is still worshipped in the early Christian period. But otherwise, politically, Assyria's time is over. But the model that this empire has actually essentially created remains unforgotten. And the idea of empire as such becomes a powerful one in the Middle East and beyond, with later states, beginning with the Neo-Babylonian state and the Persians, whom you also mentioned, and so on and so forth, and essentially up to the Ottomans in the 19th and 20th century, carrying this idea onwards. And of course, even other empires in the West, albeit only indirectly, some degree, I think, also owe this idea of empire to the ancient Assyrians. And Syria, at any rate, is also remembered in later tradition as being the first empire in world history, both in the Bible, which provides pretty detailed and often accurate information on some of these Assyrian kings of the imperial period, and also in classical sources where Greek historians, Greek Roman historians like Diodorus claim that the Assyrians created essentially the first great state, the great empire. And this tradition lives on throughout the Middle Ages and into early modernity, with Assyria being the first in this long sequence of a translatio imperii, as it is called in Latin, a sequence of empires throughout history, with the Roman, of course, the Roman Empire, the greatest of all.
That's a lovely overview, and I'm curious here, because a little bit I've read, and you mentioned the book. What do you think it was about this region of northern Iraq which, there's still many people groups that are still there today. That made it just kind of fertile ground for many civilizations to either arise from there or to be there or to have cohabitate there. What is it about Mesopotamia in general, this region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that just made it such a hotbed for so many things, whether it's trade or different like cities that pop up or people groups? What was it about that location that makes it so, unique?
I like this term, a hotbed for so many things. I think that's actually true. And it is, in fact, many firsts, historical firsts, can be located in ancient Mesopotamia. One thing is, again, geography. Mesopotamia, including what would later become Assyria, is part of the so-called Fertile Crescent. Fertile Crescent is a geographic region that starts in southern Palestine and then sort of forms a crescent along the Taurus Range in southeastern Turkey towards the Zagros Mountains of Iran down to the Persian Gulf. And what makes this region important is that in this area you have enough rainfall to practice agriculture. And if you wish, agriculture is being invented in the Fertile Crescent. This is the reason why it is called fertile. It is here where from roughly 11,000 BC onwards, and then for many millennia to come, you have phenomena such as the domestication of certain crops like emmer and einkorn, so varieties of wheat, of animals like goats and sheep and cows and dogs and so on. And where you have agriculture, of course, you have dramatic changes in the way people are living their lives. They no longer live as hunters and gatherers. They become sedentary. They create villages. They live in villages. Eventually, these villages will turn into cities. This is a very long process, and therefore calling this the Neolithic revolution is a little bit misleading, because it is really something that happens over millennia, but it does happen in this area. And many sites in what would later become Assyria are sort of key for this development. But then you can also observe that some particularly important breakthroughs in civilization, like the invention of writing, the emergence of big cities, actually happen more in the south of Mesopotamia rather than in the north. So not in what would later be Assyria, but rather in a region later inhabited by the so-called Babylonians, so a region essentially south of modern Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, which is an alluvial plain where you can no longer have rain-fed agriculture, but where you have a very fertile soil that's carried down by the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. But in order to cultivate crops in this area, you need to have organization. You need to have a managerial class. Because you need to build dams and canals to water the fields, and you have to make sure the water is then the water is again removed from those fields to prevent salinization and things like that. So in order to have that, you have to have a division of labor, and what that leads to eventually is the emergence of big cities with managerial classes, a great deal of social stratification, and so on. And that happens first and foremost in southern Mesopotamia, especially in the 4th millennium BCE. The key city here is the city of Uruk, famous as the place where later on the legendary king Gilgamesh is king. This is where, for example, writing is invented, and that writing was probably invented in Mesopotamia around 3,500 BC or so, in order to keep track of economic transactions that would take place, essentially as a managerial tool. And it takes a while, several centuries actually, for north of Mesopotamia, the area of Assyria, to assume, to adopt some of these breakthroughs. But you already have sort of proto-cities in this area around 3000 BCE. And, as time goes by, this area of northeastern Iraq becomes part of the cultural world of Mesopotamia. Also of the political world. So in southern Mesopotamia, you have the emergence of big kingdoms that rule over extended areas. First, the so-called dynasty of Agade, that begins in 2350, then the kingdom of Ur. And they seem to also rule over the areas of what would become Assyria. And so around 2500 BCE, you have for the first time archaeological traces from the city of Ashur, this place from which Assyrian culture emerges. And we don't know that much about it because, you have to dig down into these tells deep in order to find these very early traces. But it's clear that, for example, there are temples at places where later on Assyrian temples would be found, including a very important temple of the goddess Ishtar, goddess of love and war, from where we have a large number of votive figures, so figurines of men and women, actually quite a few women, shown in the act of praying and put up in place in front of a statue of the goddess Ishtar, it seems, which shows us sort of a little bit how these people actually looked like, the people who lived there. And it also seems that around 2,500 people in Ashur were speaking a Semitic language that may have been an early version of Assyrian. One of the things that define Assyrian culture is language. As always, culture is, of course, defined in important ways by language. Assyrian is a language related to the language of the south, which is called Babylonian. Both of them are part of another language family named Akkadian. And this is Semitic. These are Semitic languages that are similar to Hebrew or Arabic. So we made it easier to decipher them, in fact. So we know that some kind of early Assyrian was spoken in Ashur from 2500 onwards. Again, we have evidence also that during this time, Ashur was ruled by these southern kingdoms. In between, it was probably already independent, but we don't know yet that much about anything else. But one thing that's perhaps also important sort of about Ashur from early on, I mentioned that Ashur is sort of at the very southern end of Assyria, in an area where you have barely these 200 millimeters of annual rainfall that is required to have a viable agriculture. So further to the north, where you have cities like Nineveh or Arbela, you have more rainfall and agriculture is easier to practice. In Ashur, this is always a precarious affair. And I think this is one of the reasons why Ashur became so much a place for trade, because trade, of course, you need agriculture in order to have trade. And Ashur is conveniently located at the crossroads of different roads, north-south and east-west. So the resource-rich regions of the north and the east are connected with alluvial plains, agricultural-rich alluvial plains of the south. And while in the west, you have these steppe regions where you can have flocks of sheep and so on. Ashur is also directly on a ford where you can pretty easily cross the Tigris River. So these are also reasons why it's a convenient place to engage in trade. At any rate, trade is very much what defines that city from early on, and is a very important factor in the early history of Assyria, and remains to some extent important even towards the later phases of Assyrian history.
Yeah, I was while you were talking there, I was curious about the impact of language and these what do we say, these cuneiform types of language. And you mentioned Akkadian as a type of language, obviously Babylonian as well. But Akkadian is a little bit older, or there's some overlap with early Ashur period. Is this correct? And if so, how much of that kind of pulls or influences how Assyria was, developing as a kind of entity on its own of sorts?
Yeah, it's complicated with languages, of course. So unlike Egypt is always much easier to explain. Essentially, you have Egyptian and it's a very homogeneous culture. Mesopotamia is more complicated in a way, I would say, therefore also more interesting. From early on in Mesopotamia, you have a variety of different languages being spoken. The earliest is Sumerian. Yeah. That's the language of the very first cuneiform documents known from Mesopotamia. So in these documents from the late 4th millennium, people were writing in Sumerian. But from early on, people in this very region were also speaking Semitic languages. And those languages are subsumed by modern linguists under the term Akkadian. The earliest form of it is Old Akkadian. That's the language spoken during the time of this great kingdom of Agade, kings like Sargon of Akkad, Naram-Sin of Akkad, who also ruled over Ashur. And this Old Akkadian then splits up into two different dialects. In the south, it's Babylonian. In the north, it's Assyrian. So they are very similar. Assyrian and Babylonian, I think speakers of Assyrian would have understood speakers of Babylonian, vice versa. But they do have, characteristic differences as well. So they also mark specific identities. We can talk about that later as well, but I think it's important to note, perhaps since I'm speaking about it anyway here now, that the Assyrians from early on are very interested in this culture of their southern neighbors in Babylonia. So later on, they adopt much on Babylonian and also Sumerian literature. And even before that, from the 3rd millennium onwards, they seem to also adopt many of the deities worshipped initially in the south and make them their own. The main deity, of course, and that's another important thing that needs to be pointed out when one talks about the Assyrian identity, the main deity in Assyria is this god Ashur. That is a deity, as mentioned that already, it's the same name as that of a city and very much sort of a god that embodies that city. It's a pretty abstract deity. Initially, you could say a god without qualities almost. It's very much really identical with the city. The main temple is on this rocky crag overlooking the Tigris on the northeastern edge of the city of Ashur. Unlike deities from southern Mesopotamia, who have families and about whom stories are being told, they have a mythology. Ashur doesn't really. He assumes such a mythology later by being identified with some of these southern gods. He is a very peculiar god otherwise, though. And because he is so peculiar, of course, he is a very important marker of Assyrian identity. His image changes. He's initially this Numen Loki represents the city. He later on becomes a very warlike God, as always. Religion metamorphizes in the way politics and other features of society change. People then adapt, and religion is accordingly adapted to these new realities. But still, Ashur remains this really significant deity. While at the same time, the Assyrians also worship many additional gods and goddesses, many of whom are imported from the south, from Babylonia.
I was going to ask about Ashur, because it seems like it's not only is it the main city, but it's also the god. It's where kind of everything kind of starts and begins. And so how does that, as much as you're able to know, right, from whichever manuscripts or from various finds to know about this from so long ago, but where does this stuff kind of originate from? Is this just from a group of people? Is this from everyone getting together and saying, like, this is a god we're going to worship and we're going to name a city after it? How do we understand maybe how these, or is it just kind of like you were saying, adopting a lot of different things from other types of languages or cultures in the region? How did these things kind of form or take place?
That's still very hard to know, because writing on a large scale doesn't really begin, at least to the extent we can ascertain at this point, before roughly 2000 BCE. So the earliest evidence for the worship of deities from the city of Ashur actually comes from this temple of the goddess Ishtar, not from the temple of Ashur. But that may simply be due to the accidents of discovery at the place where, from roughly 2200 or so onwards, Ashur was worshipped. Has not really been possible to dig deep enough to find whether there were earlier traces of a very early temple. I would assume there was. I think probably the Temple of Ashur goes back to very early times, and from very early on already essentially marked the identity of the people of that very city. But when you think about Assyria and its later history, it's also important that this idea of also worshiping a great goddess is important also from early on, because, at the beginning, Assyrian culture is very much limited to the city of Ashur. Later on, though, you have these other cities like Nineveh and Kalach and Arbela. And we know that, for example, in Nineveh, you also have a great goddess who was worshipped there already during the 3rd millennium. In Arbela, it's another such great goddess. At Nineveh, she was worshipped initially, though, under a name that's Hurrian, Shaushka, which means the Great One. Hurrian, that's another language spoken in the ancient Near East from early on, an isolated language not related to any known language except for Urartian, which is also related from later times. There was a language of a population group that also lived in northern Iraq in the 3rd millennium BCE, maybe even earlier. And the culture, for example, of cities such as Nineveh and Arbela probably really is shaped very much by these Hurrians. At some point in later tradition, when the kings of Ashur expand their kingdom and Nineveh and these other places become part of an Assyrian territorial state, this Hurrian culture is kind of downplayed and replaced by a culture the Assyrians take very much from Babylonia, but it's part of this very early mix of different peoples and religions in this area. Where the god Ashur comes from, where these early Semites come from, that we know lived in Ashur around 2,500, we can't say. Maybe one day when we can excavate the deeper layers of Ashur, we will figure that out. But for the time being, all we can say is that around 2,500, after a sort of period of increased urbanization in this area on the upper and middle Tigris River, the city of Ashur becomes an important city in the north, and probably from early on, one that is especially significant for the international trade taking place in this area.
So I want to ask about that piece of it. Is it starts from like a city and becomes more of like a land, and then it gets to eventually the empire. So maybe you could talk here about some of the first rulers. Is it Pusar Ashur the first, how he governed Assyria, and then subsequent rulers after him, and then what became the interactions, as you've been mentioning, with it was Ashur as a central hub, and then it became Nineveh, and then it became other cities, and as it starts to expand, how did we start to see rulers governing not just a city, not just a region, but it starts to, as it expands, how they also change their governing style and how they incorporated trade and other types of things in the region?
So that takes a long time, actually. You mentioned this Poso Ashur the First. He's usually considered the ancestor of a dynasty of hereditary rulers who rule over Ashur from roughly 2025 or so until 1700 BCE or so. Sorry, 1800 BCE or so. So for some 200 years. Poso Ashur himself didn't leave any inscriptions, so all we know about him is from later texts that credit him, for example, with the construction of a city wall of Ashur. Prior to him, we know that at least at times there were other independent rulers in Ashur, but we don't really know much about their family background and so on and so forth. And we have a document that's very important for the reconstruction of Assyrian history. That's the so-called Assyrian king list, that essentially gives us an overview of all the Assyrian kings from the very beginnings to the 8th century BCE. That list claims, for example, that initially Ashur was ruled by kings who lived in tents and some other fairly obscure figures. But these very early kings in the king list probably became part of the king list only at some later point. They were not, in fact, early historic kings of Ashur. So with this Poso Ashur, we enter a period from which we actually have a lot of documentation. And so these hereditary rulers, starting with Poso Ashur, and others would include rulers such as Shalem Achom and Erishom I. There's no need for me to mention these unpronounceable names here. I think that's better to read them, otherwise one will forget them right away. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is that while these rulers do have certain prerogatives, for example, they're the only ones allowed, seems so, for these 200 years or so while this dynasty is in office, to write inscriptions in their own name, and they're in charge of building temples and things like that. This is what they do. while they have these rights and privileges, they are clearly not terribly powerful sort of altogether. What is very striking about these first 200 years of the old Assyrian period, so roughly 2000 to 1800 BCE, is the fact that the governance of the city of Ashur is divided between these hereditary rulers, an assembly of all the free citizens of Ashur, and an institution known as the city hall that is headed by an official named Limum in Assyrian, after whom years are named in the Assyrian calendar. So you have essentially three institutions: a pseudo or proto-monarchical institution, that's the hereditary rulers, kind of aristocratic limums who are in charge of the city hall, and this popular assembly. And the popular assembly, city assembly, apparently meets on a regular basis in an area, possibly at the place where later on the ziggurat of the Temple of Ashur is built, on the northern part of the city of Ashur. And what they do there is they decide, for example, about judicial matters. And well, in that way, of course, determine politics. And we don't have the laws that they promulgated from Ashur itself, but we have evidence for some of them from a place 950 kilometers away from Ashur, a trade colony, so to speak, where citizens of Ashur would live in order to engage in their trade activities, Kanesh in central Anatolia. And so some of these laws, for example, would say that merchants from Ashur were not allowed to sell gold and silver to merchants from Babylonia or from Amurru in the west. So there is some sort of economic protectionism in place by punishment of death. So this was something that the city assembly, the popular assembly, would be able to decide. The city hall would be in charge of weight and measures and taxation and so on. So altogether, the political system in place early on in Ashur is one that one could call sort of anachronistically a mixed constitution. Quite similar to how the Greek historian Polybius describes the political system of Republican Rome, where you have the Senate as an aristocratic institution and the popular assembly as a democratic institution, and where the consuls as a kind of more autocratic or monarchical one. So this is quite similar actually in Assyria, and the hereditary rulers are not even allowed to call themselves king. So whereas in the south, you have rulers who would use the Akkadian word, the Babylonian word shalom, to refer to themselves, which is king. Those Assyrian rulers can call themselves sort of the deputy of the god Ashur, or the overseer or prince, difficult to translate, but they are never using the term king. They also seem not to have really a palace. There's no evidence for a palace in old Assyrian Ashur. They have no court. There are no chief cupbearers also, and other courtly officers, whom you find plenty in the south in Mesopotamia, and even, for example, at Kanesh, where you have a local ruler in place who has such servants. These Assyrian rulers don't. So it's a really interesting thing that Ashur starts off as a really non-autocratic political entity, considering that it will eventually become this highly streamlined autocracy, this imperial autocracy, as which it then becomes so famous in the Bible. Of course, the king of Ashur is fully in charge of everything in this later times. This is quite striking. It's important to keep in mind that really, I mean, Ashur and Assyria undergo a number of remarkable metamorphoses before they really become this empire. As an empire, they eventually become famous, the Assyrians, but before they are an empire, they are different other things.
Yeah, I think that is important to know, and that's why for any empire, the origins are always interesting, right? Because to become great or expansive or very domineering, you have to start from some place, and it's interesting to see. And of course, you're talking about hundreds of years of time, but it's interesting to see where those origins, begin. I guess the one piece is this expansion. So as you get to the Middle Assyrian period, you're having cities now. You have some sort of land. You have, as you're talking about, these political kinds of ways of operating. You mentioned that the Middle Assyrian period is being a patriarchal society, and that there's a few kings here that bring about economic and cultural changes and patterns. Maybe just chat about how the Middle Assyrian period, worked, which was, roughly, 300 years, 400 years of time. So how did we move from, this, the old Syrian period to transition period all the way to, 1300-ish BC or just before that, and then that goes for 350 years. Just talk about what was the key moments or key figures for the Middle Assyrian period.
Yeah. So you have an interesting moment already in Old Assyrian times when a foreign ruler, pretty colorful personality by the name of Shamshi-Adad I, conquers Ashur, and for a while so creates a large territorial state of the kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia, as it is called by modern scholars, that rules everything so from the Middle Euphrates area in eastern Syria to the Zagros Mountains. A pretty powerful state. Ashur is not the capital of the state, but one of its major cities. And this king, the Shamshi-Adad, leaves inscriptions in Ashur in which he clearly indicates that Ashur is important for him. His calendar practices draw on those of Ashur. This doesn't really last very long. His son and successor, Ishme-Dagan, is already very much weakened. And when he eventually, in the 18th century BCE, when he dies, this interlude of these powerful territorial rulers is over, and the previous model of divided governance is put into place again. I think, though, that the people of Ashur must have remembered this time. This was, for them, an opportunity to see that you can have a very different system, very different political system in place, where you actually have a king. This Shamshi-Adad is a king. He calls himself a shavu, a real king. And so I mentioned there's this dark age. So between 1700 and 1400, we know very little. The Assyrian royal dynasty remains in place. But otherwise, it's very hard to say what happens. What we can say is that these Hurrians, I mentioned before, that they create a state of their own now, the so-called state of Mitanni, centered around a city named Vashukani in what is modern Syria and eastern Syria, and put a lot of political pressure on Ashur. Ashur remains over long periods of time somewhat independent, but these hereditary rulers there were still in place. They feel this pressure, and they see probably, as time goes by, that they need to adapt in order to be able to somehow cope with this constant pressure if they want to keep their identity as Assyrians. Up to this point, Ashur is also remarkably peaceful. This is quite interesting. Again, Ashur becomes this, you mentioned it, these villains in the Bible constantly conquering foreign places. And I mean, that is what they do in the first millennium and starting around in the 14th century. Initially, they don't. Whereas in southern Babylonia, in the first half of the second millennium, you have endless wars between city-states and sometimes larger territorial ones. Ashur essentially stays away from the fray. They don't engage it. But at some point, the rulers in Ashur realize that in order to remain competitive, they have to adapt to this situation where you have also an army and where you have a king and where everything becomes more autocratic. Again, how exactly this came about, we can't say. But in the 14th century, we have this king, Ashur-uballit I, who is the first Assyrian ruler to actually assume this title of a king, who communicates with other kings of territorial states of the same time, including the king of Egypt. So the Egyptian pharaohs write to him, and he writes to them. And these letters written in the Babylonian language and in cuneiform were found in Egypt at a site known as Tel El Amarna, famous for being the capital of the hereditary pharaoh Akhenaten. So they communicate with these Egyptians, with the Hittites in the north, with the Babylonians, and they also start to expand. And expansion soon becomes part of the state ideology also of the religious matrix of Assyria. The coronation ritual, which is put into place to celebrate the coronation of the Assyrian king, includes a statement, a call made by the high priest of Ashur, essentially in the name of the god Ashur, which requests from the Assyrian king that he expand his land, Rapish Matka, expand your land with your just scepter. That's what this text says. So after this very peaceful period that preceded the Middle Assyrian period, now suddenly you have kings who are very keen on expansion, and expansion by military means. This seems a big step and a major transformation in two respects. There's also continuity. I mean, on one hand, this idea of acquisitiveness. I mean, the Assyrians were always interested in acquiring wealth. They did it up to this point through trade. Now they do it by military power. And at the same time, there is this vast geographic framework within which they operated before. During the Old Assyrian period, they had these trade colonies in Anatolia. They traded tin and textiles from Babylonia and from the east for silver from Anatolia. They knew how logistics work when you travel far and wide. And of course, you can use that for trade, but you can also use it for military conquest. They adopt some of the military qualifications of the Hurrians. It's interesting that the main title of the Assyrian chief marshal, the main general of the Assyrian army is Tortanu. There's a title that goes back to the Hurrian language. So they apparently learn from the Hurrians how to fight. And eventually they do fight. And they capitalize on internal unrest within this state of Mitanni, this western state ruled by Hurrians, and eventually expand into the area of that state and more or less take it over at some point. And then have a kingdom that includes cities like Nineveh in the north and Erbil in the east, but also cities on the Chabur River in eastern Syria. Now, the Chabur River is so and so far away from the Tigris River. And what the kings soon realize is that it's important to have a representative in this area to be able to react to any kind of act of unrest and so on. And so they put into place a viceroy who's henceforth in charge of the western portions of the Assyrian Empire. And this already shows you the problem, of course, of every empire. If you have a large territorial state, then the center, the political center, may have trouble to get its orders fulfilled in areas far away. So the Assyrians solve that by means of having a representative of the Assyrian king with a lot of authority in the west. They also start sort of using a lot of violence, including gouging out the eyes of their enemies, flaying them, and talking about that extensively in their inscriptions. Everyone did this sort of thing. I mean, including the Egyptians and later, of course, on the Romans also. So when modern audiences consider the Assyrians unspeakably brutal and much more brutal than other peoples of the ancient Near East, it is important to take into account that the others did the same thing. But the Assyrians are indeed perhaps more outspoken. They also portray these acts in imagery and so on. To some extent, this is probably sort of self-indoctrination to a significant extent, sort of making sure that the Assyrian elites confronted with images and texts about sort of endorsing violence are willing to actually practice violence. It's not so much perhaps about deterrence, which has often been believed. But they do this. They also start to deport significant portions of enemy populations. That's another thing that defines the Assyrian way of conquest for centuries to come. Wherever they meet resistance, they seize large parts of the population, including especially the elites, and then deport them to other places of their kingdom. On one hand, with the goal of destroying local identities and political alliances, but also, of course, to have a workforce wherever it is needed. because labor is always, there's always a labor shortage in the ancient world. So labor is a limiting factor to economic development. And by deporting lots of people to places, especially inside, of course, in the center of Assyria, they have the workforce to work on these construction sites, to build new capitals later on in the first millennium and so on. But they also have agricultural workers wherever they need them, perhaps rather in the east than in the west and so on. So these are practices that we can see emerging in this time, especially in the 13th century when this massive expansion takes place.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that you're showing in a variety of different ways is how you mentioned it a little bit there, of as an empire begins to expand, you start to have different things you have to manage, which can be difficult, especially as you're geographically moving further away. And especially as you're encountering or dealing with, other communities or other people groups or what have you, which may have their own interests that can be advantageous for one group and less so for another group. And so it does seem like there is a kind of sort of trial and error here that's going on. But then when you get to, and this is in the middle of your book, kind of closer to the height of the Assyrian Empire, is where you have the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III up until Sargon I, and then you have Sargon II and Sinatra after him. So maybe just talk about how we ramp up to Sargon II and Sinatra, because those are the kind of the big rulers, and those are the ones that are obviously in the Bible as well, and in the historical books, and I think in First and Second Kings and Minor Prophets and stuff. So kind of how do we ramp up to that period?
Right. So the Middle Assyrian period leads to this expansion of Assyria. Assyria becomes a territorial state with major Western possessions, but it isn't yet an empire. It's a kingdom. And it actually faces a major crisis. So starting in the 11th century BCE, that's part of this big crisis known often connected with the so-called Sea Peoples, but also probably having to do with climate change, greater degree of aridity around this time. Assyria suffers incursions by Arameans who conquer portions of the western parts of the Assyrian kingdom in the 11th and early 10th century BCE. And that happens all over the place. This is the time when other states collapse entirely. The Hittite state in Anatolia comes to an end. Babylonia is in dire straits. Egypt is reduced to its core areas, is no longer able to interfere in the Levant. So Assyria is also affected by this, especially by these Aramean incursions, but less so than others. The city of Ashur is never conquered, and the Assyrians are the first ones sort of to get back on their feet when the climate actually becomes again more amenable to start having better harvests and so on, which happens in the later 10th century BCE. So this is a time when rainfall increases again. And of course, that enables the Assyrians then, based on economic surplus that they can create, to send armies back into the areas that would before. So what you first see in the first millennium BC is that the kings of that time sort of reconquer areas that they had lost before. And this happens, for example, under the reign of kings such as Tukulti-Nota II, Ashur-Natsir II. So Assyria essentially, Assyria reconquista, if one wants to put it with a somewhat anachronistic term, reconquers the areas that it ruled before. Ashur-Natsir II does another thing. He moves the royal court away from Ashur to a new capital, the city of Kalach, which is sort of in the center of Assyria. So it's when I mentioned this triangle formed by Nineveh, Ashur, and Arbil, Kalach is in the middle. Kalach is a much bigger city than Ashur, but Kalach is still a city where essentially Ashur-Natsir can start from scratch. Through his conquest, he has a lot of money, and he has the ability now to build massive new temples, and especially a massive new palace, which becomes the new sort of center of his power. And this move away from Ashur probably also means that he is now less dependent on the ancient aristocratic elites of the city of Ashur. So the Assyrian kings become ever more powerful. under his successor Shalmaneser, the Assyrians engaged in many campaigns further into Western areas, up to modern Phrygia, or so in Anatolia. There are campaigns to the Mediterranean, but they are not yet able to consolidate these conquests. So they receive tribute or so, but then they go back. And there's actually then in the early 8th century, there's even sort of something you could call a crisis of the crown, because suddenly you have again some important Assyrian administrators and generals calling the shots. The Assyrian kings remain formally in power, but they are kind of weakened. And so in the 760s and 750s, you have a real crisis, also caused by pandemics, it seems. So we are living in a time when this, of course, is a topic on everyone's mind. It is quite striking that here we have a situation where we see from Assyrian chronological documents that Assyria is ravaged by plague. What is really surprising is that then suddenly in 745 you have this new king, Tiglath-Pileser III, coming to the throne, that in the immediate wake of this pretty major crisis, this king, this Tiglath-Pileser III, suddenly engages in a conquest of foreign territories on a scale never seen before. By the end of his reign in 727, the size of the Assyrian, I would say by now empire, because now it actually has become one, is twice as large as before. So he really is a king, this Tiglath-Pileser III, who changes things substantially. He also, unlike Shalmaneser III, when he conquers an area, he turns it into a province. He isn't just happy with receiving tribute or so, but he annexes places. He turns them into Assyrian provinces. He builds sort of a palace that is sort of a small image of the Assyrian royal palace at Kalach. There has a provincial governor, usually eunuch, so they wouldn't actually create dynasties of their own. And those eunuchs would be in charge of taxing people, making sure that a surplus of the agricultural goods produced in the provinces are sent to the Assyrian center, have armies stationed there that the Assyrian king could use on his way to additional conquests. All this is implemented at this time. So it's a big change. And again, it's striking and difficult to explain, of course, why does it happen after this major crisis? And I would argue in this book that it happens exactly because of the crisis. The expansion under Tiglath-Pileser is a reaction to the crisis. Among other things, the plague must have led to a major reduction in the Syrian population. And of course, by having these conquests and having mass deportations taking place, according to his inscriptions, Tiglath-Pileser deports no fewer than 600,000 people, even though that may be a little exaggerated, probably not so much. So he gets the workforce he needs again. And he gets the wealth that Assyria might have lost. So, it tells us something about history not being determined by anything, unless, it really is, of course, if the challenges are too big, then you cannot do anything about it. But Tiglath-Pileser is able to react to these challenges. He reacts in aggressive ways. So this isn't exactly a role model for our time. It's rather a warning, I would say, that bad actors might do things in a moment of crisis that others should be aware of. It really depends here, of course, on to what extent you identify with Assyria as an historian or you don't. Right. At any rate, this is what happens. And this is the birth, I would say, of the Assyrian Empire. And then you have kings like Sargon II, like Sennacherib, like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, during whose rule this empire becomes even more powerful. It also experiences a number of crises. We know an awful lot about it because now we have really many sources, very long royal inscriptions telling us about the campaigns, but also letters and treaties and administrative and archival and legal texts, literary texts from Assyrian libraries that tell us something about Assyrian culture during this time. So it's not only sort of exciting to study this empire because it is really an important political development we can trace here, but also because we simply know so much about it.
Yeah, so tell us about, I guess, I'm curious. I know Sargon II was a huge figure, so you can chat about him real quick, but also about Sennacherib, because he you talk about his third campaign and how he couldn't defeat Jerusalem, which was pretty surprising if this is such a big empire. Maybe just talk about how they govern and maybe about this third campaign a little bit.
Right. So Sargon, as I mentioned already, really successful with his various conquests, reconquers Babylonia, among other things that Tiglath-Pileser had conquered already, but that had gotten lost again. Secures the West, where also he had to face a number of rebellions. The West, that is actually sort of the Levant, the area closer to the Mediterranean Sea, and that brings us, of course, also closer to ancient Israel and ancient Judah. Those kingdoms that are, of course, better known to an educated public than these Mesopotamian ones, because they are so prominently featured in the Bible. I mean, this is after all ancient Israel. So at that time of Sargon, you still have essentially two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. But the northern kingdom is already severely reduced to a core area around the city of Samaria after Tiglath-Pileser III had conquered Israel and had essentially brutally assaulted it, had annexed parts of it to Assyria, and then only left this rump state. Under Sargon, even this rump state of Samaria, it comes to an end, probably already on his predecessor, Shalmaneser V, and Israel essentially is divided up into Assyrian provinces and is no longer an independent kingdom. And Sennacherib then becomes king after Sargon, after his very successful reign, is actually killed on campaign to the north. It's another story, but I think I might not tell it because it might get us into areas too complex to discuss here. So Sennacherib faces another rebellion in the west. Places like Tyre and Edom and so on and so forth no longer pay their tribute. And that includes also Judah. Judah, by that time, is a vassal state of Assyria. Judah was smart enough not to fight Tiglath-Pileser III when he attacked. They said, okay, we accept that you're the great king, we pay you tribute and so on, but leave us in peace and we want to remain independent. But then they are part of this rebellion after this violent death of Sargon II, with which King Sennacherib has to cope. Sennacherib comes to the throne in 705 BCE. For the first 4 years or so of his reign, no one in the West pays taxes anymore. Then he starts a campaign against the West. This is essentially a very successful campaign. He starts off conquering the area of the kingdom of Sidon, which he manages to do when everyone else sees that this works, that the Assyrians are successful. Then many of these other states are sending their emissaries there and actually pay fourfold tribute in order to make up for the non-paid tribute of the 4 previous years. But there are also some places that do not pay and that remain defined. The city of Ekron, for example, which is eventually conquered, and in fact, the land of Judah. At that time, the king in Judah is a king by the name of Hezekiah, featured very prominently in the Bible. And Hezekiah, who sort of conspires with the people of Ekron, the Philistines there, says, no, I want to remain independent. I'm not going to pay taxes to the Assyrians. I'm not going to submit to them. And that leads to this showdown where Sennacherib's troops in 701 BCE then invade the land of Judah. And based on what we learn from Assyrian sources, but also to some extent from the Bible, they are essentially initially quite successful. And they force Hezekiah to pay tribute. And here we have a case where we see that the Bible actually gets certain things quite right. So both the Bible and the Assyrian annals of Sennacherib claim, among other things, that Hezekiah would eventually pay Sennacherib a tribute of 30 talents of gold. So it's clearly a very specific datum. And where we see that, okay, here the biblical report is based on the chronicle or something that is clearly accurate. But then the Bible, Sennacherib claims, when we look at what he says, what happens at Jerusalem, he claims that he sort of courts Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. Hezekiah was no longer able to leave his city, nor were any other people in Jerusalem. And eventually he paid this big tribute. And then Sennacherib decided to accept it and return to Nineveh. Essentially a great thing. the Bible has it very differently. So in the Bible, you read that Hezekiah, praying to God and being encouraged by the prophet Isaiah, does not really yield to Sennacherib and opposes him. And then the story culminates in a tale according to which the Assyrians have camped near Jerusalem, and then during the night, the angel of the Lord sort of comes down on the Assyrian army. 185,000 Assyrians are killed. Sennacherib is forced back to Nineveh, and essentially, there eventually is killed by his sons. And there's some truth in that. He is eventually killed by his sons. We know that. But the business with these 185,000 killed Assyrians, of course, is fantastic. This is a later theological interpretation, an interpretation that wants to present Hezekiah as a great hero. It seems to me the truth is that the Assyrians probably made a cost-benefit analysis and realized that Jerusalem, which is not easy to conquer, which is sort of in this rugged, somewhat hilly Judean land, was not worth the effort of a 3-year siege or so. And since Hezekiah was willing to pay tribute, it was actually better for the Assyrians to accept that tribute and leave him in place as a loyal vassal. And the Judeans from then on were loyal vassals, and Hezekiah's successor Manasseh, who is considered a bad king in the Bible, ruled for some 40 years, is known to have sent tribute to the Assyrians and even helped them with troops during their campaigns against Egypt. So here we have different sources telling us different things about an event that I think we can reconstruct with a certain degree of accuracy. But there are questions, including, again, what does it mean that there is this angel of the Lord mentioned? And some have argued that this is, in fact, an allusion to another kind of plague, that the Assyrian forces at Jerusalem were struck by an epidemic, and that was what caused their return. I'm still undecided when it comes to determining whether that's possible. There is actually a story about, in Herodotus, the Greek historian, about mice attacking an Assyrian army under Sennacherib at Pelusium in Egypt. And mice are kind of rodents that could relate to plagues and so on. And so it's hard to be absolutely certain. And I would say that there is also the possibility that there was this additional crisis the Assyrian army was facing, and that might have played a role. It would be nice if we had additional sources at some point to determine this. This is one of those cases where scholars, since the first inscription of Sennacherib were uncovered more than 170 years ago, have worked on. So have compared these Assyrian sources on one hand, the biblical on the others, and have tried to make sense of it. It is an embarrassment of riches of sources, but the sources are sometimes contradictory. And so the historian here is at it's an interesting challenge to really see what's happened. You mentioned that my history book is objective. Of course, that would be nice, but we can only aspire to that. And our any approach to history, of course, is always also subjective. And
sure.
You have to make up your mind at some point and say, this is what I believe, but I'm not sure.
It is subjective in the sense that it does. It's not biased like a holy scripture said is. There's some bias there, of course. It is interesting hearing about this. Just for listeners, people will be familiar with the stories of King David in the Bible and Solomon, and so there was 3 kings. Is it Saul, David, and Solomon? Yeah. They each ruled for 40 years, so it's 120 years total of what they call the United Kingdom of Israel. And in 975 is when there was the divided kingdom. So you basically had the northern and the southern kingdoms, and they had divergent ways of governing and being governed, if you will, by certain empires. And so in one of these, in the story that you just told, which is detailed in First Kings, is that right? I think that's right.
Yeah, the later in 2 Kings, but
Second Kings, yeah, is where you see the Assyrian army and how they this account. Also as a note, if towards the end of the Old Testament, if people look at this, you'll see a bunch of prophets, and they're categorized as major, minor, just because of the length of the books that are put in there. And Isaiah is one of the so-called major prophets, but the chronology fits with First and Second Kings, just as a kind of long footnote there. And so it's interesting, as I said, because that if you read it from theologians or people that have various biblical commentaries, there's a certain type of topspin that's put on how these stories are told, or how these accounts are told. And so it was interesting seeing it from from an Assyrian historical text, where it's like, yeah, there's a lot of things here that converge, but there are question marks, and sometimes in other sources, the question marks become a supernatural event. And so maybe it is all true and maybe none of it's true, or there's another explanation for it. Hard to say at this point, but it is curious at the least. So there's this one bit that you talk about in the book. You talk about all of these various aspects, but one question I had was, during the empire, and of course there's a lot of conquering and taking over, and there's a lot of shared land here. My question I had was how distinct at this point, in this kind of, at the height of the Assyrian Empire, how distinct were Assyria and Babylon? You talk about this Babylonianization of sorts of Assyria, and I'm curious of how that manifests in many components of their culture, especially generationally and downstream. Where does, because obviously we have the Babylonian Empire that comes online, and so I'm wondering, where does Assyria end and Babylonian kind of stuff begin, and where's the crossover, and how do we make, I guess, historically those distinctions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best way to conceptualize the relationship between Assyria and Babylonia is to think about it in the same terms as one thinks about the relationship between Rome and Greece. So Rome is this great conqueror state. Greece is this harbor of culture and philosophy. The Assyrians, very much like Rome, adopt from the Babylonians important aspects of the religion. I mentioned that already, and also their literature and their scholarship. So we actually have very few literary texts written in the Assyrian language. The literary and scholarly texts that we find, for example, in Ashurbanipal's famous libraries, are almost all written in Babylonian, some of them even in the ancient language of Sumerian. So Ashurbanipal, just to be brief about this, king who ruled from 669 to 631 BCE, famous for actually having created what one could consider the first universal library in world history. Some 30,000 tablets and fragments have been unearthed at Nineveh that belong to that library. And these texts include famous epics such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, hundreds and thousands of omen texts, rituals and incantations, medical treatises. So the earliest large corpus of medical texts that we know is actually from ancient Mesopotamia. These are texts that are written in the Babylonian language. So the Assyrians very much sort of endorse Babylonian culture initially, as I said, perhaps as an antidote to Hurrian culture. They want to get rid of that, but then really out of a genuine admiration, it seems, for it. They consider it really the fountainhead of wisdom. This is something where the Assyrians are really very much in love with Babylonia. At the same time, like with Greece, Assyria wants to rule over Babylonia. So they are willing to give Babylonian cities all sorts of privileges, tax privileges especially. So that Babylon doesn't have to really pay taxes like other places and so on and so forth. But they do want to be recognized as the rulers, the makers and shakers in the Babylonian south as well. And here the problem arises because the Babylonians, from the very beginning, I mean, it starts already in the middle of the Assyrian period, when Tukulti-Ninurta, the first Assyrian king to conquer Babylon, the Babylonians are not so enchanted with this idea that the Assyrians actually rule over them. And so what happens after the birth of the Assyrian Empire is that again and again, the Assyrians sort of conquer Babylon and make themselves king of Babylonia. But the Babylonians rebel. They they don't accept it. It happens at the end of the reign of the predecessor of Sargon II, for example. And it happens again during the reign of Sennacherib, the king who is most famous actually for this attack on Jerusalem. But for Sennacherib himself, it was probably the altercation with Babylon that was more important. It was an altercation that was dramatic. It began with the rebellion right at the beginning of his reign, and several others followed. At its height, the Babylonians made common cause with the Eastern Elamites, enemy of Assyria, and even delivered Sennacherib's son, who had been made a king of Babylon, to the Elamites, who probably killed him. At any rate, Sennacherib developed sort of a strong hatred of Babylon, it seems, at this point. And eventually, when he conquered Babylon in 689 BCE, he entirely destroyed it and describes this destruction in graphic terms, so graphic that it was really unusual, even for Assyrian style texts, and certainly shocking when one considers that this was the omphalos of the world, cultural center par excellence. But it's also clear that, for him, Babylon was still important as a cultural matrix. So in order to somehow cope with this destruction of Babylon, what Sennacherib tried to do is to recreate Babylon and Babylonian culture in Assyria, especially the city of Ashur. So he recreates the cultic infrastructure of the god Marduk, the city god of Babylon, in Ashur, making Ashur, the god of Assyria, the new Marduk, even kind of rewriting the Babylonian epic of creation that features the Babylonian god Marduk as the great creator god and hero that vanquishes a female chaos monster. So Sennacherib replaces Marduk in that epic with the god Ashur, and so on and so forth. So somewhat ironically makes Assyrian religion much more Babylonian than it had been before. It doesn't really work out, though. This is a pretty exciting sort of religious reform that we can trace here. But the power of the cultural sort of image of Babylon is so strong that eventually, under Sennacherib's successor Esarhaddon, Babylon is being rebuilt. Then there is yet another sort of war with Babylon during the reign of Ashurbanipal, the library king. At that time, Ashurbanipal's brother, Shamash-shum-ukin, is king of Babylon. So this is also a war between brothers. It's a war between sibling civilizations, a war between brothers. For that reason, perhaps exactly, it's particularly violent. Again, the Assyrians, in the end, are victorious. In 648 BCE, Babylon is again destroyed. Shamash-shum-ukin dies in the flames of his palace in Babylon after a mission by Esarhaddon's by Ashurbanipal and Esarhaddon's sister to sort of make peace between the two has failed. Assyria prevails once more, but it's the last time for Assyria to prevail in this conflict, because then, a few decades later, in 626 BCE, it is actually Babylon that will prevail. So then this very last altercation between these two civilizations, that's when a new king becomes ruler of Babylonia. The Assyrians are chased away from there. A king by the name of Nabopolassar makes an alliance with the Medes, people of the east, and together with them he manages then to conquer Assyria. And then, really sort of in a deliberate attempt also to wipe out the memory of all these many humiliating defeats that Babylon has suffered at the hands of the Assyrians, he now turns the table and he destroys Nineveh, and before that, Ashur is being destroyed. So the hatred that the Babylonians must have felt that leads to this utter destruction in Assyria between 615 and 612, I think can be explained through this history. So it's a history of love and hatred at the same time.
Yeah, it's really interesting how there's these kind of ebbs and flows that kind of happen. You mentioned kind of this kind of internal war between the two brothers. Obviously, also in there is how they conquered Egypt in 671, which is a big point. But I just want to fast forward to the fall, I guess. So Nineveh's fall is a big piece of this. And between 627 and 605, you kind of classified as a type of, one of the first kind of world war of sorts. I guess the main question here is, what were some of the reasons for the Assyrian Empire's quick and rapid fall, so quickly and so fast?
Yeah, so this is really, of course, a question that historians need to grapple with. It's a difficult question. The one answer I give you will not be the answer that other scholars may give you. As with all great events in world history, when you think about the actual root causes, it's hard to pinpoint the one that really is decisive. So first of all, I mean, I've already alluded to it. The events as such, we actually know pretty well. We know that at the death of Ashurbanipal in 631, there is internal kind of uncertainty about succession in Assyria. And this is not for the first time. There's always however sort of powerful the Assyrian Empire is, the moments of the death of a king, who is so much the linchpin of this whole political system, there is a degree of instability that's somewhat dangerous. And we see that again unfolding after Ashurbanipal, who has been king for several decades, must have died so very old. How it plays out then? So it is a son of his by the name of Ashur-etilani. He becomes the next king, but he's clearly a plaything of the all-powerful chief eunuch, an officer, administrator who has become very powerful in the Assyrian Empire, when he sort of the eminence grise behind this young prince Ashur-etilani. And from early on, Ashur-etilani has to sort of also seems to fight against a brother of his by the name of Sin-Shahu-Ishkon, who also claims that he would be the legitimate Assyrian king. So there is a sort of moment of internal instability. There also is already probably some kind of a lack of legitimacy on the part of the Assyrian king from the later reign of Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal is a fascinating king. I could say a lot of things about him. I mentioned the great library that he created. He created some of the most beautiful Assyrian art, or rather his artists did many beautiful reliefs. For example, the lion hunts from Nineveh now exhibited at the British Museum, among the most famous works of art from the ancient world as such, and rightly so. There are also some particularly impressive scenes of warfare. But it's interesting when you read through the lines of some of Ashurbanipal's inscriptions, you can see that, for example, Ashurbanipal never went to war. He was afraid. He made sure that there would be some kind of prophet turning up and saying, no, don't go. The goddess Ishtar is going to do things for you. And Ashurbanipal stays home. And of course, the Assyrian kings would never go into the fray of the battle as they claim in the inscriptions, but we know they would be sort of stand on a nearby hill where battle was fought and be directly involved. Ashurbanipal stays at home in his palace. So I think this weakened the authority of the Assyrian kings. And then what happens is that in Babylonia, you have suddenly, after several years of fighting between Assyrian and Babylonian troops, you have a new king, Nabopolassar. This new king is probably coming from a family of administrators in the city of Uruk in the south, who were sort of governing this city on behalf of the erstwhile Assyrian overlord. So this Nabopolassar knows how the Assyrian military and civilian machine works. He knows that pretty well. And that will help him, of course, in his fight against the Assyrians. So Nabopolassar manages to chase the Assyrians out of Babylonia. This alone would not have yet really meant that this is the end for Assyria. I mean, earlier occasions the Babylonians had rebelled as well. But now the additional factor is the Medes, so these eastern people. And here again, in a way, you could argue the Assyrians shoveled their own grave, because they were the ones that brought order into the areas where those Medes had been living. The Medes were essentially a semi-nomadic group of pretty disjointed tribes. And when the Assyrians in the later 8th and 7th centuries BCE started to campaign in the areas, they made sure that they would be better organized, so they would actually be able to send taxes and tribute. But of course, that led to a situation where the Medes at some point were able to really organize on their own, and then kind of suddenly turn against their overlords, the Assyrians. So the Medes and the Babylonians suddenly now operate together. This brings onto the plane the Egyptians, previously actually, of course, opponents of Assyria. I mentioned the conquest of Egypt by the Assyrians in 671. I mean, one of the great triumphs of Assyria, when Assyria becomes so bigger and larger than ever before. But now it seems like the Egyptians are afraid that the Babylonians might take over from the Assyrians and become the great new power. And so suddenly the Egyptians find themselves fighting on the part of the Assyrians. And this is where I think the term world war becomes, of course, it's anachronistic. And I mean, there's no overseas parties involved. I mean, that's obvious, but it is really a major, it's many different players from different continents involved. I mean, the Levant becomes involved. The Judean king Josiah is being defeated when an Egyptian army crosses the Levant in 609. Eventually, the Babylonians sent their armies as far away as Zorata in the north. The Elamites, the eastern Elamites, likewise participate. So it's a large number of different actors. It's also an enormously brutal war. The back and forth in Babylonia, cities of siding with the Assyrians and then with the Babylonians must have been a bloody affair. And then, of course, we reach this point where the combined armies of the Medes and the Babylonians conquer the Assyrian capital. It's first Ashur, which is a major blow to Assyrian religious identity, especially. The Ashur temple is destroyed, and then eventually Nineveh in 612 BCE, an event that is referenced in the biblical book of Nahum. The prophet Nahum talks about it, and also quite extensively in the Greek tradition. So this is also a world event. It's something that everyone at the time really apparently finds extremely significant. And it probably was. I mean, this great empire, this first empire, is essentially wiped out. And we sort of have a lot of information, also archaeological information. So, for example, in one of the gates of Nineveh, this is this big city with a wall 12 kilometers or some 8 miles long. It's a massive city. Jonah claims it had 100,000 people living there. It's probably not unrealistic. In this gate, archaeologists found the remains of the Assyrian soldiers and others Assyrians who were killed by the onslaught of the Babylonian Median troops there, still sort of in the contorted positions in which they were killed there. So the strategical problem for Nineveh is that you have this large wall, you have these massive gates, they're very big, and they are very difficult to defend. So it's now suddenly a strategic liability, and that enables the Medes and the Babylonians to conquer Nineveh. And this is where the Assyrian king sits. And that king, Sin-Shar-Ishkun, the last Assyrian king, is killed. There is after a coda, an historical coda, another Assyrian prince remains in office in the western city of Haran for another 3 years, but then he disappears from the scene as well. That's the end. Scores of Assyrians, hundreds of thousands perhaps, are being killed or deported. Assyria is no longer a geopolitical entity. So this is the political story. Now, the question is politics here a mere epiphenomenon? Are the underlying root causes for this downfall different? I mean, one of my Yale colleagues, Harvey Weiss, has recently argued together with a number of other scholars that climate change is again the real culprit. And I think his team has shown successfully that, in fact, the 7th century BCE saw a decline again in rainfall. The data seems quite clear in this regard. My problem with this explanation is that this massive decline starts much earlier. Essentially, it always starts in the late 8th century, and then it exacerbates in the early 7th century. So the Assyrians cope quite well with this greater degree of aridity for decades. So I can't really accept that that this is the main reason. I think there is an additional point here to be made, that the loss of Babylonia, where you have this where you don't rely on rain-fed agriculture but have artificial irrigation, that this was a problem for Syria. But for example, at Ashur, at the site of Ashur, archaeologists have also found a lot of traces of this destruction layer from 614, including grain deposits some 1 meter or so, 3 to 4 feet high in several places, several palaces and in temples, doesn't look to me like a place that has suffered from a major famine or anything caused by insufficient harvest. So to me, I think it's really, on one hand, it's this perfect storm. The fact that the Medes and the Babylonians together create this coalition. The fact that Nabopolassar, the Babylonian king, knows the Assyrian administration and the way the Assyrian military works so well, because he has grown up as part of it, if you wish, as a member of a family that worked for the Assyrians in the south. And the Medes too. I mean, they experienced the Assyrians. They have seen how they operate, and they have certainly learned their lesson. So I think this is important. And I also believe that the leadership crisis, this king Ashurbanipal is kind of a populist avant la lettre. You always have this discrepancy between the body politic and the body natural. So each Assyrian king, of course, presents himself as the great hunter, the great campaigner, and so on and so forth. But they don't usually put these claims to public to public display. Ashurbanipal does. So he engages in fights against lions in an arena near Nineveh, where of course everything is kind of staged. He claims that he goes to war as this great warrior, but he never goes to war. So I think he's being perceived towards the later part of his reign, when things start to get warm, he's being perceived as a weak ruler. And when then he dies and his successors are likewise not really able to muster universal support, it's a problem. And then, of course, we have the general problem of the Assyrian Empire. I mean, another Assyriologist, Ariel Bach, has called Assyrian Empire without mission. So it's not like they bring religion, culture, anything sort of to other places. Essentially, that's nice because they also don't expect these other places to adopt their cultural and religious ideas. But they also don't have that much to offer, except for the fact that these other places will be safe and secure as long as they pay a significant amount of taxes and accept simply that the Assyrians call the shots. But that's not good enough, it seems, to create a feeling of loyalty. So when Assyria is suddenly in dire straits in the late 7th century, no one, except for Egypt and the Manians also, Eastern people also fight with the Assyrians, no one else seems really particularly keen on supporting the Assyrians. So that also doesn't really help them. And that then leads to the end.
Mm. Yeah, it's very interesting how there's all these kind of coalitions and then people working, against one of the empires, and again, just as we've said at different points, how quickly it was able to fall. So after the fall, then, which is again, as we've said, kind of not terribly sudden, like it happened in a couple months, but relative to other, I guess, like kind of the Roman Empire or something. How did Assyria's legacy, their culture, and their history become subsumed under Babylonian, as we've mentioned, and maybe some Persian aspects as well? Or was it just entirely forgotten, or was it kind of a mix of both? Some, remnants stayed with other empires, but then other pieces we've lost to history. How was Assyria just used as a reference point for maybe other future empires?
So Assyrian statehood really comes to an end in 612 BCE, and even cuneiform writing in Assyria stops at this point. So that too indicates that this really is a moment of collapse. At the same time, it would be wrong to say that everything is gone. So in Assyria, certain elements of Assyrian culture continue. Assyrian religion lives on. The god Ashur and his wife Sheruah are still worshipped in a temple in the city of Ashur in the 2nd century AD. So even at that time, there's still people living in that city who adhere to the cult of Ashur. At places like Arbela, probably this is the case as well. But for example, when the Persian king Darius III in 333 sets out for the Battle of Gaugamela near Arbela. He does so from Arbela. So this Assyrian city, is still a city that is not entirely destroyed. But Assyria, of course, at this point is no longer an agent of history, but the people living in this area are spectators of the great battle between the Persians and the Greeks under Alexander. So this is really, in this regard, this really is a big transformation and change, and also an ending. At the same time, of course, I mean, empire is a shape-shifting phenomenon, and the Babylonian king who conquers Assyria, along with the Medes, this Nabopolassar, of course, inherits in a way this empire of the Assyrians, and creates then what is known to modern scholars as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and whose most famous king is Nebuchadnezzar II, the king who takes the Judeans into the Babylonian exile. And I mean, you see here, this is essentially following the Assyrian precedent. Deportation is a practice, of course, that the Assyrians previously undertook on a regular basis. Nebuchadnezzar II does the same thing. And in many regards, of course, this Neo-Babylonian Empire draws on techniques of power that the Assyrians created, including, for example, the fact that the palace administration under the Neo-Babylonian kings is very similar to that of the Neo-Assyrian kings, of the imperial kings of Assyria. At the same time, the Neo-Babylonian kings, of course, also stress that they are critical of these Assyrians, after all, had destroyed Babylon so many times. And it's sort of ironic that it's under the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, a king by the name of Nabonidus, that Assyrian elements come to the fore most obviously. This Nabonidus is an interesting character. He ruled until 539 BCE. And he hails from the city of Haran. This is the place where the last Assyrian sort of king prince was defeated in 609 BCE. So in a way, Nabonidus comes from an area that is in and of itself Assyrian, and he presents himself in many levels actually like an Assyrian king. So even the iconography, the way his stelae look like, the royal coats that he wears, all this is quite Assyrian, and he mentions several Assyrian kings approvingly in his inscriptions. Altogether, though, I would say the Neo-Babylonian Empire has a very mixed relationship with Assyria. This changes with the empire that comes then, and is often considered, in fact, the first great empire in the world, and that's the Persian Empire. That begins with Cyrus II in 539, when he conquers Babylon, and ends then with, again, a conquest of Babylon by Alexander the Great in 331. Initially, we can see that Persian kings adopt, for example, artistic conventions and practices of the Babylonians. A recent find in Persepolis, one of the great Persian capitals in Iran, has revealed a gate built very much like the famous Ishtar gate from Babylon, with its glazed bricks and the same kind of lions and bulls depicted on them that you find on this Babylonian gate from Babylon. But then very quickly, Persian art changes very much and becomes much more Assyrian. So what Persian art is really famous for, places like Persepolis or Pasargadae and so on, in fact, are these large relief cycles that show the king and groups of tribute bearers, that very much Assyrian style, or these big bull colossi, these massive figures of winged bulls and lions that were created by the Assyrians, sometimes up to 50 tons in weight, and the Babylonians didn't have them. So the Persians actually create an art that looks much more Assyrian than what the previous empire, the Babylonian Empire, did. So here we see continuity of motifs created first by the Assyrians, and of course, again, a continuity also of the idea of empire. This seems like the Persians, in many regards, drew more on the model of the Assyrians than on the model of the Babylonians. And of course, the Persians then have the model again sort of emulated by later empires, starting with the Hellenistic Seleucids in Babylonia, and then the Parthians, the Sasanians, the Abbasids, the Ottomans, and so on and so forth. I already talked about this. And Of course, Assyria recedes into the background as empire follows empire, but it's still, of course, the first in this chain of empires the empire that stands at the very beginning. And it's also remembered in the Bible. We can talk about that perhaps a little more in a moment, and also in the classical tradition by Greek and Roman historians. And when you read Dante's On Monarchy, for example, he says the first sort of to gain the prize of empire was King Ninus of Nineveh and of Assyria. So even there in these traditions, Assyria remains the reference point for the emergence of this idea of empire. And of course, this is important to keep in mind. I mean, when you think about history, people have lived in empires over long stretches of time. Ever since the Assyrians, the empire is a very common political form of living and organizing a state, for better or worse. I mean, I'm not saying it was necessarily in every respect a great thing. It was probably also in every respect a terrible thing. I'm just descriptive here. Empire does. I mean, the idea of empire is an enormously powerful one up to our own time, even though now where you have empires, they will usually no longer claim to be empire. Empire, of course, has now a really bad name, but the idea of empire, I think, has not ceased to excite political rulers all over the globe.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is an antiquated term, one that people get very uncomfortable using. But I think, for a while it was, used that way. You mentioned obviously the Bible, and we've been mentioning it at different points throughout the conversation. So I want to just kind of land here for a minute. So obviously, my introduction to the Assyrian Empire was obviously through my own studies, in seminary a million years ago, and I think a lot of people will know about many of these names or figures or things like that from, for some people in the United States, maybe from Sunday school or Bible study, or if they've gone to higher education and learned about this. And I guess the question I have here is that obviously the Bible is not a history book. It is about Jewish history, but it is not, exclusively that. It is a lot of different genres. You have poetry and narrative and prophetic books and apocalyptic books and so on and so forth. But how much do we feel, I guess, from a historical perspective, that the Jewish people took some of these ideas that were around the time in Mesopotamia and kind of did their own version of it, right? So if you look at the Deuteronomic code, right, so from Deuteronomy, as part of the Jewish, Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, a lot of that stuff, as you mentioned in the book, seems to have a precursor of, I think you mentioned it earlier, some of the code that the Assyrians were using. And of course you can see historically, if there's a people group that's maybe a little bit older or was using this before we start seeing this with the Jewish people, does that maybe say that they were influenced, or it's a reference point, or it's just outright plagiarized? What can we say about that? Same thing here also with Jonah and Nineveh. So many people know the story of Jonah gets swallowed by a whale, sits in there for 3 days, but his whole point was to go to Nineveh and say, he was a prophet, and to tell these people how they were in sin and, they needed to repent and all these things from the Jewish perspective. But again, that story seems to have a type of, kind of copy and paste from another story that's very similar. And a lot of these things happen in this region at this time. And so I guess what can we say about some of the accuracy historically about reading about this kind of crossover with the Assyrians that we see in the Bible, where someone's reading the Bible and can say, well, this is one perspective or this is one point of view, which is the Jewish point of view, but that's not the whole kind of historical lens here. And there is other perspectives that maybe have more or less or equal validity here. So how do you think is the best and most accurate way to kind of broach this with the Assyrian historical accounts, with kind of the biblical accounts, the Jewish account?
Yeah, it's a big question, of course. What I think one can say is that the Assyrian period, the period of the Assyrian Empire, is the first period in the formation of the Hebrew Bible. And we can see that from the fact I already mentioned that the information that the Second Kings, for example, provides about the Syrian kings such as Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib is very accurate. It's very clear that even though these stories about those kings and their interactions with the Israelites and the Judeans were later transformed, and that there is a theological agenda that was sometimes projected onto them, that this is actual sort of history, that the Judeans and Israelites must have had chronological texts in which they would have recorded their interactions with the Assyrians. And there's also, certainly not by chance, that the earliest prophets in the Bible essentially are all from the time of the late, of the Assyrian Empire, so Amos and so on, 8th century essentially. I think that is important. So one thing we can say here is that some certain things that the Bible has to say about interactions Israel, Judah, and Syria are actually quite accurate. I think, though, what is probably more important and more significant is this question of influence that goes sort of beyond, and that sort of also has something, influence that impacts religious and theological ideas. And I do think one can trace them in the Bible. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the Assyrians did not ever try to force conquered people into worshipping their own gods, that is, the Assyrian gods. In fact, I would have been offended had anyone in Jerusalem started to build a temple of Ashur. This was nothing the Assyrians were interested in. What they did, however, was that they imposed on the people they conquered loyalty oaths on behalf of the Assyrian kings. And we know that because we actually have these oaths themselves. We have succession treaties from Assyria itself, but also from places in the West, including a place not that far away from Israel and Judah, Tel Tainat on the Orontes River, where we have detailed lists of oaths that Assyrian vassals and anyone essentially had to swear on behalf of the Assyrian kings. And it is very likely that such loyalty oaths were also imposed on the king in Jerusalem and on the elites in Jerusalem, that they had to swear these oaths as well. And what has been observed, not by me, but by earlier scholars already, is that the loyalty oaths and also some of the curses accompanying them, known from these Assyrian succession treaties, are structurally and also in certain regards in terms of their content quite similar to the text that you already mentioned, namely the so-called Deuteronomic Code, that is a law code found in the book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah, which is ascribed to Moses, but assuming sort of looking at it from an historical angle, is clearly later than wherever we would place Moses historically, and is most likely really influenced by these Assyrian texts. And what is now really revolutionary and striking about these parallels is that this is not plagiarizing. This is rewriting in very intelligent and really incisive ways, revolutionary ways, in fact. Because whereas in the Assyrian treaties, the vassals are supposed to love the Assyrian king and protect him and all that. In Deuteronomy, everyone is said is requested to love God. God takes the place of the Assyrian king. And we find even pretty detailed parallels. For example, there is a clause in the Assyrian treaties that if your sister or brother or father or mother or son or daughter ever starts to ask that you worship other gods, then you must kill them. It's a pretty brutal statement found in the Bible. It is probably a rewriting of a similar clause in the Assyrian succession treaties that ask everyone who swears these loyalty oaths to the Assyrian king that he or she notify the king if your sister or brother, your parents, your children, or for that matter, a prophet or a dream interpreter, and these are also mentioned in this passage in Deuteronomy. I forgot to mention them. If any of these people ever sort of say you should be loyal to another king. So the parallels are close, but the Bible turns the sort of political focus on the Assyrian king into a theological model where God is king. And that's really a very significant shift.
So that's what I was going to ask. When you say it's not a plagiarizing, but it's a type of rewriting, is it just kind of like a point of emphasis or swapping out kind of the players in the order of things? So instead of about a political thing, it's about a deity thing, right? In terms of for God, as opposed to a party or a king or something like that. Is that what you mean by rewriting, or how do you expand on that, on how maybe it was rewritten of sorts?
I mean, it's both. I mean, of course, it's on one hand, it's possibly sort of the beginning of monotheism. Now, the beginnings of monotheism is a very complicated question, and this is not the only factor that plays a role. But I do think, the Hebrew Bible is being created in the Age of Empire, with the Assyrian being the first. The Age of Empire, of course, brings to the fore the idea of one king being in charge of the world. What the Bible does is that it transforms this idea, and it claims now, rather than one king being in charge, instead it's one God. One God there's only one God you can worship. You can't worship any other gods. This is the revolutionary act, and it comes to the religious dimension of these texts. But of course, when you say that all your loyalty is owed to God alone, this has an important political message as well. And in fact, in Deuteronomy, the text says very clearly, regarding the king, okay, well, you can have a king. Speaking to Israel now in Deuteronomy, but that king cannot have many horses or many women, and he should not actually own a lot of silver. All those things that, of course, the Assyrian king was famous for, and any imperial king would claim for himself. So there is this idea of a theocracy, of God really being the actual king. And ironically, when you look at Assyria, this is how Assyrian sort of history starts. At the beginning, it is Ashur is the king. But I think the transformation that takes place here in the first millennium is not drawing on this idea of Ashur being king, but really rather on the idea that there is this earthly king, the emperor king, the Assyrian king, and that the image of that king is projected onto the image of God. And you could say that's kind of problematic. It doesn't sound like a great idea if God is like the Assyrian king. But it's also important to sort of remember this is an act of liberation. And I think when one considers in this way, then, of course, even such a statement like the one about killing your brothers and sisters when they don't worship the right God, I think this becomes more humane when you put it into the historical context. That's also why I think these comparisons within the Bible and Mesopotamian culture in general do not have to threaten the believers. I want to sort of really address this issue here, believers and non-believers and so on. But I think for believers, it must be a relief to know that the background of rather crude and cruel demands like this one that I just quoted, that the background here is found in an attempt to liberate yourself from an aggressive imperial ruler. So this is something I would say is really significant. Now, on a completely different level, you asked about Jonah, and this business with Deuteronomy and the Assyrian succession treaties. This is not my idea. This is. I should also say it's not accepted by everyone that there is this relationship. So there remain a few scholars who say no, this isn't the case. The parallels are not close enough. So it remains something under debate. The issue with Jonah is sort of a pet theory of myself. And I can put it out for people to believe it or not. Sure. But it gives me a chance at least to briefly also talk about Assyrian women, in this case, royal women. And you had asked me about patriarchy. And so I can get back to that very briefly.
Yeah.
Essentially, Assyria is a very patriarchal society, and the Assyrian king list, for example, includes only the names of male kings. But we know from a variety of sources that on several occasions, women were also very powerful, influenced the kings, or even became sort of regents. One was the wife of King Sennacherib, who was very much in charge during the reign of her son Esarhaddon. So I won't get into that now, but it's an exciting story. And she even built a palace for him and things like that. Another one, though, is an earlier queen, a queen by the name of Sammurammat, who was the wife of an Assyrian king, Shamshi-Adad V, and the mother of another, Adad-nirari III, and was active around 800 BCE. And we know that this was a really very powerful woman because during the early years of when her son was king, inscriptions were written which claim that she went with her sons on military campaigns, which is unheard of before and after. Very unusual. She had a stela dedicated to herself as the first woman among many, many other similar stelas dedicated in honor of Assyrian kings and administrators at Ashur, and some additional evidence for her really being very powerful. This queen became kind of the nucleus of a whole set of later legends, mostly known to us from Greek tradition, actually, where she has metamorphosed into a figure named Semiramis. And basically, what the Greek sources say about her is that the Semiramis was born as the daughter of a Syrian goddess, Derceto, in Ashkelon, in the Eastern Mediterranean. Her mother, ashamed of having born her out of a union with a mortal man, threw herself into a lake and turned into a divine mermaid, took on features of a fish, in other words. Semiramis then grows up, being nourished by doves and then being adopted by shepherds, and in fact has her name, according to the legend, because it means something like dove. Eventually, she also turns into doves, so doves are important for this whole story. Is found among these shepherds by an Assyrian official named Onis, brought to Assyria, discovered by the Assyrian king when she shows herself to be a great strategist when the Assyrians try to conquer the city of Bactra in eastern Afghanistan. The Assyrian king forces Onis to commit suicide, marries Semiramis himself. This king then dies, and then Semiramis roots on her own and essentially becomes this great figure that creates the Assyrian Empire. So in this later legend, it's a woman who essentially creates the empire, an empire in later tradition even larger than the actual Assyrian Empire, ranging from Ethiopia to India. So modeled on later empires, actually. So this legend, of course, isn't historically accurate, but it draws on this figure of Semiramis, who becomes queen in Nineveh, in Assyria. Now, when you look at the story of Jonah, at first glance, you may not see why there is any connection here with this legend. But Jonah means dove. That's what the name says. And there are all these connections in the Semiramis legend with doves. Jonah's greatest feat, of course, is that he is being swallowed by this great fish, stays in the belly of that fish for 3 days, and then is back out on dry land again. Later on considered sort of prefiguration of Jesus's 3 days in the tomb. And then there's the connection with the Eastern Mediterranean and with the city of Nineveh, where Semiramis ends her days. So there is actually a lot that these stories have in common. So the dove connection, the thing that Semiramis has been the daughter of this divine mermaid that becomes sort of a fish when she throws herself into the sea. Semiramis is born in Ashkelon, which is close to the place where Jonah allegedly went on the ship that brought him onto the Mediterranean after he had failed to go to Nineveh, which was what God had demanded of him. And then when he is eventually sped out, he does go to Nineveh and ends his days in Nineveh, just like Semiramis. Again, you could say that's just fortuitous, and these parallels are not sufficient to establish any kind of borrowing. But for me, these 4 parallels are strong enough to say that can't really be by chance. Now, why and how the story of Semiramis, which clearly had Eastern origins, how and why and by whom it was transformed in the story of Jonah, where you have this sort of female Assyrian queen being turned into male biblical prophet, Why that happens is unclear. We know nothing really about the author of the Book of Jonah. Was that meant to be funny? Was it kind of a satire? Was it deadly serious? It's really not clear. But it's also interesting that both these stories are really sort of set within empire. I mean, Semiramis clearly is this first imperial queen. Jonah operates within, an imperial worldview where he's sort of set to travel to Nineveh, but doesn't, instead wants to go to Tartessos, which is in Spain, and ends up in Nineveh anyway. This is very different from other biblical prophets where everything is very narrow and very focused on Israel and Judah and the other places playing a really important role. So this is another parallel. So I do think in order to understand the story of Jonah, one needs to keep in mind in one's background, in one's head, this story of this Assyrian queen. Semiramis, a story that goes back to an actual Assyrian queen, whose name was Samur-Ramad.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, again, kind of like what I was saying, it's hard to sometimes, I think, for people to remember that, each culture is going to have their own history, their own accounts. What's fascinating to me, I guess, is the kind of not quite comparative history, but how there's overlap with all of these things, right? Because they're obviously, I guess maybe as an example is, if you were to read about, the Second World War, well, you could read about it from the German perspective, you could read about it from the British perspective, the American perspective, the Japanese, and you're going to get crossover, but you're going to get, a different vantage point, right? And I think that there's it's appropriate to have some type of humility, I guess, of sorts, of saying, like, there's different vantage points, there's different points of view. Of course, people, I guess, could, argue the philosophical, question of which is the correct reality, which, it's all perceptions in some ways. But I think it is important to know there are some actual facts of events that actually occurred, which I guess the last question I have is sort of along those lines. I was surprised to read this. I remember when this happened, and I was absolutely just gutted about it when it occurred. But towards the end of the book, you talk about sort of this kind of what you call this second destruction of Assyrian artifacts by ISIS. I believe it was in 2015. I could be wrong. And I remember when this happened, and it was heartbreaking because you have, items that are from literally thousands and thousands of years ago, and when they're gone, they're gone. And there's so many things that we could understand and know, and not to mention for the legacy of folks still in that area. So I guess a few kind of sub questions on this. Kind of just talk about that event, what was destroyed, how can we better protect Assyrian artifacts? Do we know of any descendants from Assyria that are currently living, or is that just too far? And I guess what are the ongoing efforts to understand and protect and preserve, Assyrian history?
Yeah, I agree. Of course, the events of 2015 were heartbreaking. So what had happened was that ISIS had taken the city of Mosul in 2014. And from there had embarked on a campaign of massive cultural cleansing, as one can legitimately call it, which included, it took them a while, but eventually included the destruction of some key Assyrian sites. Mosul is just on the other side of Nineveh, opposite. I mean, Nineveh is on the opposite side of Mosul. In between is the Tigris River. So that was very unfortunate. ISIS started off with destroying a mosque, actually, on top of one of the mounds at Nineveh. But then in 2015, began to also attack Assyrian monuments, including, for example, the massive bull colossi in one of the gates of Nineveh. Other gates of the city were destroyed as well, were really literally bulldozed. In the case of this bull colossus, electric drills were used. The throne room of King Sennacherib, of which some reliefs were still in situ, or still in place at Nineveh, was entirely razed to the ground. the museum in Mosul, which displayed many artifacts from the Assyrian period, was destroyed and the artifacts hacked into pieces. The site of Kalah or Nimrud was dynamited with barrel bombs, so that the throne room of King Ashur-natsir II was destroyed. Even the ziggurat, the temple tower, massive structure, was bulldozed away. So it was really disaster. Other sites were affected as well. Now one can, of course, ask, why did they do that? It seems like unnecessary effort to destroy ruins, essentially. And I think it is important also for us scholars to think about what happened here. And well, ISIS issued a magazine, Dabiq, in which they outlined their bloody ideology. And they have an interesting article in 2015, anonymous article, where they justify these attacks on the cultural heritage. And they make essentially 3 points. On one hand, they say they do it because they wanted to annoy the West, of course, always a main enemy of these totalitarian Islamist terrorists. And they were quite successful with that. And I mean, the irony here is the discovery of Assyrian sites in the 19th century, and much of the archaeological work in Assyria, also in southern Iraq and Babylonia, was conducted by Western scholars and adventurers and so on and so forth. And even though in the past decades and since the essentially beginning of the 20th century, local people had more agency than before, it always remained to a certain extent a Western thing to do this. And it is interesting, of course, that this worked. I mean, you said yourself you were horrified, and many people in the West were horrified when they saw these images, much more horrified probably than they were when they heard about, for example, these terrible things that ISIS did to the Yazidis, also enslaving and killing and raping women and whatever else there would be. Yeah. Tells us also something about the way that the West reacts to the news. So this was one thing they wanted, and I mean, this was some extent of in order to recruit more people, because this assault on the West in every regard was probably seen as a recruiting tool. Ironically, they used with these videos they displayed of these destructions. They showed it in videos and so on. They used sort of technologies of media technologies, very, very Western in style, and I mean showed everything sort of in the form of these images, which otherwise, of course, anathema in Islam and so on. There were certain contradictions, but still, this was one thing. Another thing was that they wanted to make sure that people in the Middle East would not draw on these ancient civilizations, Assyrian, Babylonian, whatever, as a mark of identity. These were pre-Islamic civilizations, and as such, anathema to them again, because all that counts for ISIS is, of course, Islam. Everything that isn't Islam is bad. And if the people in these areas sort of feel them like they have a connection with Assyria or Babylonia, that's not a good thing. They need to get rid of it. And it is also, again, true that the nation-building efforts in places like Syria or Iraq, those pretty artificial states created on the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, to a certain degree by Western powers in the wake of World War I, that the rulers of these emerging states did make the ancient pre-Islamic civilizations sort of one of the core ingredients of an emerging national identity. So this was important for nation building, and that was something ISIS wanted to deconstruct. So these would be elements that ISIS was keen on getting rid of. And of course, then there was the additional sort of official religious idea that these were images of gods and demons, and because this was unacceptable for Islam, all this had to go. But actually, most of them weren't deities, and no one worshipped them anymore. So it isn't exactly particularly a convincing argument. At any rate, I mean, this happened as long as ISIS was in charge, in Mosul especially, and also in a few other places in Syria. ISIS also engaged in massive acts of looting. They, for example, dug massive system of tunnels underneath this mount of Nebi Yunus at Nineveh, where they had blown up this mosque on top, and took artifacts from there to sell them on the antiquities markets. That was one way for them to finance their activities. So this was another thing they did. They essentially stayed in power in Mosul until 2016, and then Iraqi forces with allied forces from other countries who took the city in a very bloody battle. And since then, slowly but steadily, efforts have been made to, of course, first and foremost, to rebuild Mosul, which had been entirely destroyed, especially the old city, but also to somehow check on the antiquities there and see what needed to be done, what could be done. And it is actually quite striking. I mean, considering the extent of the damage and also the brutality with which ISIS ruled in Mosul, really unprecedented brutality in every respect, that sort of a few years after this happened, the first Western archaeologists returned to the area and started again to document the damage, but also sort of to do some excavation work. So, for example, at Nineveh, a German team working along with Iraqi colleagues started to explore these tunnels that ISIS had built underneath Nebi Yunus, and in the process uncovered, among other things, a palace of King Esarhaddon and the throne room of that palace with two thrones. Very exciting. And we don't know for whom the second was, either for this Queen Mother Nakia or for the son of the King Ashurbanipal. It's not quite clear, but it is very exciting. They found many new tablets. The gates were explored. New texts were found there as well. Attempts have been made to secure the rubble from Kalach and in the Mosul Museum, for example, to reassemble some of the destroyed statues and inscriptions. So this has been going on. But I think one thing that's very vital and very important, and several of my colleagues are working in this respect, hard in Iraq is we need the local stakeholders to get involved. So it needs to be the local people who consider the Assyrian heritage and the heritage in general of ancient Mesopotamia really as something they are closely connected with, that they it's something important for their identity, but also maybe in the future something that may draw tourists to these areas. Of course, this is a long-term prospect. I've just been in Iraq in last year in Baghdad, and I can't see that mass tourism is returning to the country that soon. But again, some things change more quickly than one thinks. And so there have been initiatives, one named the Al-Nahrain initiative, which is spearheaded by professor at UCL in London, Eleanor Robson, who received a pretty significant grant to involve local stakeholders in the dissemination of knowledge about ancient Mesopotamia in Iraq. Other Iraqis are being invited to London to learn about conservation techniques and restoration techniques, because, of course, restoration and is what given at this time is really very much needed. And when destruction is so enormous that it's unlikely that everything can be reassembled, much is lost forever. That's also clear. But again, the irony is archaeology in general, in and of itself, is a destructive activity anyway. So that wherever you dig, even when you really document what you do very well, you put away the layers on top, and they are no longer there then. This is the one opportunity to study them. Now, by virtue of ISIS having destroyed certain areas, you will suddenly have access to others. And so this destruction work has, in a somewhat ironic and perverse way, enabled us to gain new insights about Assyria. And so this is, of course, you asked me about to conclude with a few thoughts on the future work on Assyria and what we can expect in the future to happen. So one nice thing about the field of Assyriology, in which I am which I work, is that there's always more stuff. Because people in the ancient Near East wrote on clay, there are these hundreds of thousands of texts that they left, and that essentially may be broken also, but because clay is more or less indestructible, where you dig in these areas in Assyria and Babylonia, elsewhere, you will find texts, you will find architectural remains as well, of course. You will find private houses, you will find temples and palaces and so on. So ongoing excavation will produce more texts. And of course, there's much more to learn about Assyrian history, whether it's the imperial period, whether it's these transition periods, these dark ages that I mentioned. I'm sure we can expect more tablets to come to the fore and tell us more. I mean, just a few years ago, in last year, I think, in a place named Mardamam in northwestern Iraq, a large archive of texts was found from the Middle Assyrian period again. So my work in Baghdad, for example, when I went in last year, is on unpublished texts from Ashur, from a Middle Assyrian palace archive. So there is this dimension, of course, of new finds. In this respect, we are in the same position as Egyptologists. They always also have new stuff, and in a better position than classicists whose corpus isn't exactly growing the same way as ours is. So this is one of the really exciting aspects about Assyriology. And it's the first half of history. I mean, this is also something that's not as marginal as it is usually perceived, I would say. And the other one, of course, is that new questions need to be asked. The textual material is already available. I mean, in these tens and hundreds of thousands of texts. Many of them need to be read. I mean, many are in museums and collections all over the world. Here at Yale, we have the Yale Babylonian collection. About 2/3 of its roughly 35,000 tablets and fragments have been published in some form, but 1/3 hasn't yet. It's a lot of material, not to speak of collections like the British Museum or the Baghdad Museum or the Museum in Istanbul, where much larger numbers of texts remain unpublished. So this needs to be done. And then, I mean, you need to have people who ask interesting, intelligent questions and contextualize these materials. Again, I pointed out we have lots of these oral inscriptions. I didn't talk that much about these letters, these Neo-Assyrian letters, which tell us so much about what goes wrong in the Assyrian Empire. The royal inscriptions tell us, oh, this is great. The Assyrian kings say, oh, we won this battle, I built this temple, everything is great. The letters is when administrators and spies and internal informers talk about rebellions in the periphery and insurgencies, even at home. I mean, we didn't talk about Esarhaddon in the year 671 when he conquers Egypt. That very late year, letters tell us there were 2 major insurgencies against him in Assyrian cities. So we get all this information, and this material is still not sufficiently discussed. There are no commentaries, for example, in classicists. When you work with classical texts, I mean, you have lots of modern commentaries on these texts that try to contextualize them in all sorts of ways. This is all lacking. So while there are very few scholars in my field, there's still a lot that needs to be done, and so research is ongoing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super important for understanding, for archaeology, for anthropology, for just understanding various civilizations. And I'm sure as our technology gets better, it's also can be very helpful as well. And thankfully, that you've been able to get back there, and it seems like it's not as conflictual as it was, 6-7 years ago. So that's probably a good thing. So. Yeah, it's really, really exciting stuff, because I feel like understanding more about our ancient civilizations, we just learn more about us as humans and how we've done things and can learn things, and I think it's important. The book is called Assyria: The Rise and Fall of the World's First Empire. It's fantastic. Where can everybody find the book, and where can everybody find yourself?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's coming out in April 2023 with basic books. And, well, I mean, you can probably order it online, but you can also find it, I hope, at least in some decent bookshops. So it is an attempt on my part to write in a way that is a little more accessible than, well, what scholars usually do. Of course, much of what we write is extremely technical. This book is an attempt to make the world of Assyria accessible to a broader audience. And yes, I agree with you. I think Assyria does tell us something about ourselves and where we come from, and how what's still relevant to us today actually emerged. It also, I think, may help people gain a more complex idea about the history of the ancient world. I mentioned the strange changes and shifts in Assyrian politics from a pretty sort of democratic and mixed constitution to a more autocratic one. So I think something most people wouldn't expect. It talks about climate change and pandemics as important factors in driving history, another factor, another important issue for our own time. So I hope those would be reasons for some people to be interested in the book.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Well, I can't say enough thanks for coming on. This was such a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. I'm sure listeners will as well. So it's a big, big thanks for you and all of your time and your energy and your wealth of knowledge. So it's much appreciated.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, and it was fun to talk to you too.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.